It was a tale of two halves, and at the end of the day, the Pitt Panthers are not victorious as Pitt falls to Duke. The Pitt Panthers losing 77 to 69 to the 24th ranked Duke Blue Devils after it looked like they maybe were going to run away with this game at one point. This is our Pitt post-game show here on Pittsburgh Sports Live and, of course, also on Pittsburgh Sports Now. I am Mike Asti, and I'll be joined by our Pitt basketball beat writer, George Michalowski, to talk about kind of what happened in this game, how it was different from the first half to the second half. His co-host Burton being the leading scorer for the Pitt Panthers, how Nellie Cummings played, and then everything else with Pitt moving forward, and how Pitt has been coming into this game over Duke, and what this could have meant for the program, but what it does now mean that they did not end up getting the victory on the road at Duke. So, George, it's an easy question, but it definitely makes sense when you watch this game. Pitt had a comfortable advantage early on, and also this is a Pitt team that has really been riding high recently, and a Duke team that's not like Duke teams of old. They certainly are vulnerable, whether they're home or away. Pitt felt like, I'm sure, they could win this game. They had a 43-32 lead after one, and they end up losing 77-69, 45-26, the differential in that second half, and it almost felt like it was more than that. The same team did not show up in the second half that was there in the first half. So what happened to let this game get away from Pitt from the first half success to the second half?
So two things. Obviously, Pitt's got a thin front court this year. Without John Hughley even traveling to this game against Duke, he hasn't played in, I think, 5 or 6 games.
Yeah.
They're stuck with Federico. Not stuck with. I mean, they've been good players. Federico, Guillermo Diaz-Graham, essentially the only true forwards out there, along with Blake Hinson, who, is also going to be playing on the outside for the majority of the time as a, offensive player. So Hinson's been guarding down low in some of these games, but against a team like Duke with, as much size, as much skill as they have down low, it's going to be tough to go 40 minutes without, letting Duke take over inside. And that's exactly what Duke did. 29 rebounds for Duke in the second half. That compares to Pitt's, 13. So, Duke hammered the rebounds, hammered the boards. They took advantage of Pitt down low. And then on the offensive end for Pitt, the guards really struggled. Jamarius Burton, 3 of 11 in the second half. I think Blake Hinson went 1 for 6 in the second half. So Nellie Cummings had a nice half. And when he's shooting well, when Nellie hit those first few shots of that second half, mid-range, I think he hit a couple threes as well. It felt like Pitt, would have been unstoppable down the stretch. When Burton's hitting shots, that's, the norm now for this Pitt team. When Hinson's hitting shots, it's like, okay, yeah, he's the leading scorer. That's the norm. But then when Cummings gets in there as that third guy, that third scorer, it really gives this Pitt, offense another dimension. And he looked like a real threat in the beginning of that first half. But, outside of Cummings, Pitt really struggled to score. Its guards were freezing cold in the second half. And, it resulted in some rough runs and some rough numbers. I mean, 19-2 run for Duke to take the lead, into the second half. Pitt went over 6.5 minutes without scoring a point. Even when they got to the free throw line, Blake Hinson missed a free throw short. That, obviously it's one point, but the front end of a 1-and-1 you miss, and Duke gets a dunk on the other end. They continue their run. They get all the momentum in the, in the world in Cameron Indoor. So, Duke really just took advantage of Pitt's thin front court, Pitt's young front court. Obviously you saw Guillermo Diaz-Graham get a little heated. People are pissed off about some foul trouble online. I don't think
I was going to
I'm not
get there.
one
That's our chat right now. Yeah, a lot of it is about the refs. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I understand some of those calls. I didn't understand the technical on Burton at all. I mean, even the announcers on ACC Network were saying, "Look, that didn't look like it was, on purpose at all. It was a basketball play. He had been fouled. His arms were flailing. Yeah, obviously his elbow catches him in the head, but I don't understand that call. I mean, I believe they called a flop on Blake Hinson. Would like to see the official ruling there. That kind of moved along quickly. No one really knew what happened there, but it looked like Hinson did flop. I know Jeff Capel was mad that that foul was called because Hinson really just fell down, and didn't foul anyone, but it looked like he flopped to me. So if they called a flop, that's the call. But then the rest of the fouls that people were getting mad about, it seemed to me at least like Pitt was just hurting itself, putting itself in that position,
Yeah.
to get those 50-50 calls. So like, let's say, Duke shoots up a shot. They had 24 offensive rebounds, I believe, in this game. That's almost as many rebounds as Pitt had in the entire game. So when Duke was getting these offensive rebounds, they were scoring second chance points. I think they had 19 second chance points. And then Pitt was just fouling. They were scrapping. They were
Yeah.
using their hands. They were jumping on everything. Especially with the young guys with, a really young core down low. Federico, I saw, Guillermo Diaz-Graham fouled out. He was pretty upset about some of those, but you watch him back and they weren't really playing the most stout defense. But I do see the concerns of Pitt fans toward the refs. I do see some of those calls, but you cannot blame this game on the refs if you're Pitt.
And also, you have to expect, and I'd imagine this is what Jeff Capel's saying and going to tell his team, when you squander a double-digit lead on the road, you can't then really be mad at the referees, because even if calls didn't go your way that should have went your way, or even if there's controversy involved, you're also at fault for puttering this game away, and you have to expect the home team in a conference game, especially when it's Duke, let's be honest, even with Coach K not standing there, it's still Duke. They're going to get calls. If Pitt was
Right.
home and this was the height of the Jamie Dixon era or before Ben Howland, they would be getting calls as well. So when you establish yourself as a successful program year in and year out, what Pitt is trying to get back to, and you're home, you're going to get home cooking. It's not fair, but that's just the way it is. And despite all those calls, Pitt still should have probably won this game, because you mentioned the rebounding. And yeah, Duke had a big edge rebounding wise, 100%, certainly offensive rebounds, but Duke also turned the basketball over plenty in this game. So in terms of taking care of the basketball, Pitt did it at least better than Duke. And maybe that's the annoyance of some Pitt fans here. They blow a big lead. You have some bad calls, and the opponent takes care of the basketball worse than you, yet beats you. Generally speaking, the recipe to get a win is kind of what Pitt did. But again, they blew it down the stretch. They got cold. And then, yeah, when you're getting that out rebounded, you're going to have some problems. You mentioned Ugley being out so many games, and even going back to the beginning of the season, that blowout loss to West Virginia, which I'm sure Pitt would love to play again, because they've been playing really well since then. And West Virginia has been struggling, certainly in conference play. But that was without Ugley. Clearly, Pitt is a different team without him. That is obvious. But what can Pitt do to avoid a game like this, that basically the glass decided this game and lost them this game, if they're not going to get Ugley on any type of consistent basis? It's almost like this team now needs to realize if they get him, it's a bonus. If they don't have him, that's just regular. And they got to figure out a way to be a contender without him, even though that wasn't the plan entering the season.
Right. I mean, I think they have to rely on their guards. They've been doing it all year. Jeff Capel talked about gang rebounding. Everyone needs to have 3, 4, 5 boards instead of one guy leading the team with 11, 12. Jamarius Burton had 5. Nike Sabandi had 6 rebounds tonight. That's kind of a recipe, or at least what they're going to have to try to do is continue to gang rebound. Stay out of foul trouble. The bigs getting in foul trouble has been huge. It's been tough to overcome for them so far, but it all comes down to making shots and scoring. Like we can talk about anything in this box score, anything we watched, any of the fouls, anything. If you go over 6 minutes and late in the second half without scoring a point, you're not going to beat Duke at Duke. I don't care what else. I don't care what the score was at halftime. You're not going to beat Duke at Duke. They've got all these 5-star talented kids, and while they weren't necessarily playing, to the best of their ability, aside from Kyle Filipowski had a tremendous game, 28 points.
Yeah, 28 points,
rebounds.
15 rebounds, even 2 assists. He had a great game, although I was actually going to bring up later, he had a great game, but he did actually ironically cool off in the second half, despite Duke eventually pulling away to come back and get the win. Most of that production was from the first half, so it's almost like Pitt was able to neutralize the rest of the team, make it just him to beat them and say, if you can't do it, Duke's not going to win today. And that was enough for a big lead for Pitt. And then once the rest of the Blue Devils got involved, then it was a problem, even though he was able to kind of take the backseat offensively and then just do it as a rebounder and feeding others. But for a while, he was the only Duke player in double digits in scoring. They end up with another, but yeah, almost a 30-point game for him, and they end up with two others. So they had 3 players with double digit scoring, most of that from the second half for the other ones.
Yeah, I mean, Ryan Young added 7 inside. He was posting up the smaller bigs that Pitt has. Mark Mitchell had 8. He's 6'8", 6'9", but he's still, just as forward-like as these young bigs that Pitt has. Again, like Guillermo Diaz-Graham is a skinny guy. He's not physical. Jeff Capel said the other day he's not physical. So they've got to find out how to play him in that, Euro ball type role. And when you're playing a team like Duke and you don't have John Hughley, which, like you said, is kind of becoming the expectation for Pitt fans. I don't know about for players, but right now, I've heard he's practicing. That's really all we know. He's been practicing as of late, but obviously tonight Pitt comes out. He didn't travel to Duke, so Pitt comes out, says he's a non-COVID illness, so he didn't travel. So obviously without Hughley down there, it's going to be tough, especially when Ryan Young. Mark Mitchell and Filipowski had 16 and 11 in the second half alone. So it's like you can only let Filipowski beat you for so long. And he really was just so dominant. And then those other guys chip in with 7, 8. Tyrese Proctor had 9 from a guard spot. It's like it's a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for a massive run like Duke went on. But yeah, man, like I said earlier, it's you just got to score. You got to – it sounds so dumb to say, but if Pitt kept up what they were doing in that first half, I think they could have withstood, these runs that Duke had, this offense that Duke posted on the other end. And foul trouble obviously becomes a thing, becomes more of a focus when you're down, and it gets really deflating for a team. And Pitt got emotional. They're an old veteran team, but – some of the veterans aren't always on the floor because you need Federico, you need GDG to be on the floor. So it's tough to stay focused, to stay locked in. And Pitt did it for a while, but in the end, Duke got the best of them. It's a close game. I think overall in the last 4 games, I know we highlighted these a while ago. You would have liked to see Pitt win these last 2, Clemson and Duke, but to go 2-2 in those 4, Pitt caught the attention of a lot of people around the country. Pitt caught the attention of a lot of people in the city. So I think overall you can't be you can be bummed about this game, obviously, if you're a Pitt fan, but you can't be giving up on this team. Like the schedule is favorable coming up as well in the ACC compared to this gauntlet that they've ran through in the past 4. So
you have Georgia Tech, Louisville, Florida State, Wake Forest, then Miami as the next bunch in a row. Pitt actually will now have a break until Saturday, obviously still a conference game. And as you mentioned, you do have to, it's hard. You do have to keep this into perspective if you're a Pitt fan, because entering the season, if somebody told a Pitt fan you'd be flirting with a ranking, Joe Lenardi would have you making the NCAA tournament in his early bracket, and you'd already have a couple conference win under your belt, and you'd be hanging right there with Clemson and Duke and feel like you maybe should have beat Duke on the road, especially without Hughley. A lot of Pitt fans would take that. I think Jeff Capel secretly probably would take that. You could argue this season's already been a bit over expectations to this point, talking about people writing articles about Pitt basketball being back. And I think you kind of touched on the vibe. The vibe is really what's returned a little bit in terms of excitement around Pitt hoops, regardless of where they finish. But to bring it up, because they have played above themselves a little bit here, they do lose to Clemson by 1 point, which is another gut-wrenching loss. You feel like you blow this game in a way, whether it's ref's fault or your own fault, you blow this game in a way. You had a big lead and then lose it on the road. You have winnable games coming up, and yeah, you already did get a couple in the ACC, but what could these wins have done for Pitt? And then where does the Pitt program stand now in terms of you had Pitt in brackets, you had Pitt getting votes, etc. Pitt was almost probably with this win would be flirting with the top 25, if not getting ranked based on what Pitt has done. It wouldn't be insane to say that even if they're a little outside, but it didn't happen. So does that create a scenario where the national media is going to kind of revert back and say, well, yeah, they're better than expectations, but we were getting a little too excited? Do we have to wait and see what they do in the rest of conference play? Does beating up on Georgia Tech mean anything because you didn't get it done in the bigger games? Like now, what's the vibe around Pitt since it was high above where it should be maybe, but
Right.
then playing competitive in games you don't actually win, you still have the whole end of the big games. Pitt is still not winning.
To answer your first question, with these 2 wins, that they would have been huge. They would have cemented Pitt in that bracketology discussion, like we saw kind of bubble up this past week. People saw Pitt as a 10 seed, as a 7 seed in these, Fox
Yeah.
Sports, ESPN brackets, and that was even after the Clemson loss. Joe Lunardi had them in his bracketology after the Clemson loss. So I really don't think this loss will completely turn off national media, bracketologists, anyone, opposing coaches from this Pitt team, because they've got 14 games left, 11-6 right now. I think it's completely possible for this team to win 20 games. And with a 20-win season, that's a very difficult thing to do. That's earning respect. That's something that puts you on the bubble. That's something that,
It's
if you can,
it might be a tournament season based on the
right.
conference. Yeah, not that. I mean, usually 18 is kind of a bar for a lot of teams. That probably should get you in, honestly.
Right, right, and especially because the Virginia win was huge, North
Right.
Carolina win was big, but they're
Right.
struggling right now. So, but the Virginia win's a big win. They've got some solid wins under their belt so
Yeah.
far. I believe 4-2, maybe 4-3 in
Yeah.
quad one
I mean, the
games.
West Virginia loss looks really bad now,
It
but
does.
Hughley wasn't there. Nellie Cummings did foul out at the end. So that's another thing that's kind of been a trend, that when you mentioned the lineup and having to get a big in, which maybe could hurt some of your shooters, when Pitt doesn't have one of their star players at the end of these games, it does seem like just all hell's breaks loose, especially if it's Cummings. But then if he's out of there because they want to worry about rebounding to secure a lead or try to come back or extend possessions or whatever the case may be, you then lose the shooter. So again, it's hard to kind of put this lineup together, I think, in a winning way without Hughley, but that just is the case for this team. But yeah, the resume, you could argue one way or the other, but it's better than where people would have thought right now. And these wins would have really probably won an argument. Pitt maybe still has some in front of them they can get, but it has to sting a little bit because it feels like Pitt should have won these games. And you go 2-2 in that streak you mentioned that could have been wonderful if they at least go 2-2. Imagine if they were 4-0. Imagine that,
Right,
where Pitt would be right now.
right, and most people did say when we started that streak, and when PSN put out that story about how do you think Pitt will do in this 4-game stretch, most people were like, okay, 2-2, this team remains a NCAA tournament aspiring team and has a shot to win those 20 games on the year, a shot to win 18 games and get
Right.
on that bubble. So now it happens, and of course with the losses coming in the ways that they have, Pitt being right in these games, having the halftime leads, losing in the last few minutes, it's going to be tough to swallow for Pitt. It's going to be tough to rebound from for the team, but I still think this team, is not done. I don't think I just don't see them completely falling apart like we've seen in these past few years with this group. It's a completely new team from the past few years, so those comparisons are really out the window at this point. But you'd like to see the veterans continue to play well. The veteran guards continue to play well. I know Nellie Cummings didn't have any assists tonight. Obviously, it's something that he's prided himself on. That the team is highlighted this season. He's one of the best
That
assist
is
men in
odd.
the
Yeah,
ACC.
I would have put a lot of money
Yeah,
that he was going to get one, honestly. Yeah.
right. Yeah, Nelly 0 assists. Looking at the stats now, Hinson 10 points on 3 of 8 shooting. Not their best games in terms of the roles we've seen them play earlier this season, the winning recipe. But Cummings
Right.
had 14 points. You can't complain about 14 points for him. That's a great game offensively for him scoring the ball. He took on more of a scorer's role in that second half. So especially when there were some harder matchups. I know Duke was switching some of their bigs. I saw Direct Lively. That kid's the number one prospect in America last year in high school. Obviously hasn't. He's an ACC preseason rookie of the year.
Right.
Obviously hasn't lived up to that hype yet. I don't know exactly if there were injuries, if there was anything causing him to sit or anything, but he was guarding some of Pitt's guards. I saw him on Burton a few times, causing trouble. So they had a lot of athleticism on that Duke team, a lot of length, a lot of size. So it was a tough matchup for Pitt. Obviously, these two last losses to end that 4-game streak will sting, but I still think they've got a shot. They've got a road to around 20 wins and aspirations of an NCAA tournament.
Yeah, and maybe this is coach speak, but Jeff Capel maybe could try to spin it and maybe think of it as humble pie to his team a little bit, because maybe they were getting confident, feeling secure. Okay, we're playing above ourselves. Fans, everyone's getting excited again. We're seeing positive coverage come our way, which has been a while really for Pitt based on the teams in recent years. And maybe they got comfortable. I don't know. But yeah, you do lose these two recent games. That has to sting. This team has certainly played well recently. They've played well and played competitive, even in conference play. You have Georgia Tech and Louisville coming up on the schedule, and I don't think you could ask for much more here. As we round out this post-game show, Pitt does lose to Duke 77-69 on the road, a game that Pitt really had in hand in the first half, and then it just got away from them. George Michalowski of Pittsburgh Sports now here joining me. What do you need to see exactly in those upcoming games? Certainly Georgia Tech coming up on the schedule here on Saturday. Obviously, that's a 500 team. Louisville's been losing to everybody. So does it have to be a situation where Pitt wins and wins comfortably if they're looking at NCAA tournament berth now because they did lose these games despite them being close? Do they just need to freaking get through these and get those wins? Or are they kind of must-win games to get enough of a conference record, since you can't guarantee anything else, and you do have Miami, which is a ranked team after that stretch? So those games seem really important to show that Pitt is really back, and to add to that resume, losing one of those obviously would kind of shut up of what's been said the last couple weeks. What do you expect kind of to happen, and what needs to happen in those upcoming games?
Yeah, I'm not going to put the must-win tag on them because I don't think one loss against one of those teams will crush this team, will crush the season aspirations or anything, the expectations. But I think they are important games, like you said. You've got to beat the Louisvilles and the Florida States and the Georgia Techs of the league if you want to make the tournament. Wake Forest, they're a pretty solid team again. That's going to be a tough one.
Right.
But it's at home. It's at home, so that's nice. Miami's also a tough one. They're, I think, number 16 in the country right now. Again,
Yeah.
at home.
Then you have North Carolina again. Obviously, they're going to be really hungry to beat Pitt.
Right. They're going to be hungry. That's going to be in Chapel Hill. That'll be very tough.
Right.
Looking down the schedule, though, Louisville at home after that, Florida State at FSU, Boston College, Virginia Tech. Those are also kind of middle
That's
of the pack.
why I know you don't want to
teams,
say this, and Pitt's been a good team, so it sucks to say, but like I do kind of feel like Georgia Tech and Louisville are must wins, because even though you feel like you're as good or better than, say, Wake Forest and certainly North Carolina, who you did beat, it's pretty hard to sweep a series with North Carolina. You feel like you might drop that one on the road if they can start playing better. And you do have Miami, which is a ranked team, even though that is home. So if you beat Miami, but you lose to some of these other teams or vice versa, you got to have a certain amount of wins. I mean, must win is hard to say because this team could clip off and beat anybody else. They've shown they can beat really good teams, but if you're losing to the bad teams, you're going to have problems when you're going to then be in must-win games against the better teams in the conference. But I don't think this team wants to be in that situation.
Right, I completely agree with you. I think I was more trying to say like a loss to Louisville isn't going to have the national media saying fire Jeff Capel.
Oh yeah, sure.
It's not at a point where it's one of these losses is season over of that sort. So I do agree with you. I think it's really going to be important to win those games for Pitt. Especially because they can contend with those other teams. They can contend with the big dogs. I don't see why they can't beat Miami at a home game. Coming up in the next few weeks after a road trip. The Pete has been as full as we've seen it in the past 4 years. These past few games, I assume the fans will still come out and support them, especially if they can get some of these wins. And then you've got the tougher games, but Pitt's shown us this year. They're going to compete with the top teams in the ACC. So. I don't understand why that can't keep happening, and I expect it to keep happening. I expect some close games down the stretch here.
Yeah, and honestly, you do kind of see a change. I mean, just scrolling Twitter during games and just watching games and kind of seeing the atmosphere, certainly when Pitt is at home, there's more of an excitement this season, certainly than last year, certainly the year before, and really in a while. So I don't think anybody expected an NCAA tournament out of this team this year. That was kind of pie in the sky. Maybe make an NIT and have that be a big turnaround year to get people back around Jeff Capel for the future, maybe flirt with an NCAA bubble. They get some more of these wins, regardless of these close losses here recently. Two good teams. They're looking like that bubble's not going to pop against them. And really, even if they're on the verge of the tournament, you got to look at the totality of the season and where they were a season ago, what the expectations really were, and what's even happened off the court that's affected this team and how this roster was supposed to work. And again, Ugly not out there. It's one thing to say they would have still probably lost by 25 points to West Virginia, who at that time was playing really well, and you're not going to make up 25 points unless you have a Shaq game. But you could probably feel if you're Pitt, if you had Ugly in this game, you win. Probably. I mean, this probably was a game that if Ugly is even at 85%, obviously if he's injured, no. But if you get close to a healthy Ugly, you probably feel like you win this. He probably would have cleaned up some of the problems, and the rebounding would have at least been more narrowed, certainly at the end of games and end of half. So that has to – it gets in Pitt fans' craw, but that could be a blessing in disguise and maybe glass half full for this team to think to themselves and how well they have played in a way, despite these close losses, without – their best player. You take the best player out of most of these other teams, they're obviously also going to lose. That'll be it for this edition of the Postgame Show. The Panthers do lose on the road. Could have won it. Should have won it probably. Didn't win it, though. 77-69 on the road. Cameron Indoor, it's a victory for Duke. They win a lot there, but this is one that I don't know how happy with they are either. They got to play better themselves, but they got ranked. Pitt's still trying to get there. George Michalowski of Pittsburgh Sports Now. Find his coverage there, and Pitt will trek on now to Georgia Tech and the rest of the ACC schedule, which does get a little easier coming up. So that maybe could add some retribution, and you still look at the totality of, hey, 2-2, maybe get 6-2, 7-2. I mean, then you're looking at really impressive stretch there in conference, despite some of these games that Pitt, I'm sure, wishes they could have back.